let's just highlight that: reasoning ability, social judgment, and impulse control. That's the whole ball of wax when it comes to 99% of the cases that we handle. The question is, why on earth did they make this choice? Because everyone says you chose to do this and it was your choice and your consequence, and I guess that's true. But the question always is why. And if you have no good, rational, true, credible explanation for why, you're leaving the story in the hands of the prosecutor and unfortunately in the hands of the judge, which is you're a bad person, you don't care, you're thoughtless, you're heartless, you're greedy. All of these stories that the government wants to tell, and there's a better story.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing.
Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. I am so excited about this week's episode of Set for Sentencing. My special guest today is Dr. Ted Lidsky. I could spend about 20 minutes giving Dr. Lidsky's entire bio, but I'm just going to read the first paragraph of because it's really what we're talking about today. Dr. Lidsky is a psychologist, licensed in the state of New York. He's trained in neuroscience and psychology, but his specialty is behavioral neuroscience and neuropsychology. And more specifically, he is an expert in the area of the effects of drugs and metals on the brain and behavior. A major component of his work concerns the effect of lead on the developing nervous system, lead's impact on brain development and brain functioning. And that is exactly what we're going to spend today talking about. It is so incredible to have you here. Welcome, Dr. Lidsky. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So this is our origin story. I recently encountered Dr. Lidsky on a capital case that I was working on. Of course, I was handling the development of the mitigation video aspect, and I had an opportunity to sit with Dr. Lidsky and learn from him. And what was overwhelming to me is, as a criminal defense attorney, as someone who's been doing this work coming up on 30 years, as someone who's handled over 1,000 cases, lead has never been on my radar. And that means, like, I've talked about this in the context of autism spectrum disorder and other things. That means when you don't know what you don't know as a lawyer, you miss major important issues in the case that could have a huge bearing on mitigation at sentencing. And this is one of them that hit me like a ton of bricks, that this is out there. It's an issue. So we're going to talk about what the issue is, how to spot it, what to do about it. And hopefully this is going to be really enlightening for everybody. I have no doubt it is. So I don't even know. Where do we start, Dr. Lidsky? Tell me about lead.
Well, it's a lot to say. Lead is a toxin, it's a poison. I'll be talking today about its neurotoxic effects, which is effects on the brain. But lead is poisonous to all the organs in the body. It has effects on the heart, effects on kidneys, effects on manufacture of blood cells in the bone marrow. It affects everything. Okay, I'm talking specifically today about its effects on the brain and the effects on behavior. And to start with, lead is poisonous to people of any age, but it's particularly poisonous to kids. It's essentially a child's poison for a number of reasons. One is that children in a given environment with the same exposure to lead, a child absorbs much more of it than does an adult. Secondly, the body holds on to much more of it in a child. Third, more of the lead proportionally is, is posited in the brain of a child as compared to an adult. And finally, lead is particularly poisonous to developing brain cells. And the brain of a human being goes through tremendous development in young children, and actually continues later on through teenage years into the early 20s, but particularly in the first 5 or 6 years, which is the time most kids get poisoned for a number of reasons. The brain is going tremendous development, and as a result of that, is particularly vulnerable to the effects of lead.
And I'll interrupt real quick because I want people who are listening this to know, because you can get the podcast audio only on all the podcasts, but it's also on YouTube. And this is going to be a good episode to go over to YouTube, the Set for Sentencing channel, because Dr. Lidsky has a lot of slides here that accompany this talk. So there's visuals. So check it out on the YouTubes. All right. So I don't want to disrupt your flow, but I guess what I'm super interested in is what are some of the common ways that a child gets exposed to lead?
Lead-based paint used to be the best house paint, but over the years, science has shown that it's dangerous. The dust that comes from flaking lead paint is dangerous. Finally, in 1978, it was outlawed. Right? Lead was outlawed in gasoline in the United States in 1985. Right? But the remnants remain in houses. They remain in the soil, in the environment. The way kids usually get poisoned, the most common way, is when there is lead in a house, lead-based paint. It could be under the layers of paint that were applied later on. It could be on friction surfaces like on old windows and doors. It comes off as a very fine dust. When a baby is crawling on the ground, put their hands in this dust, which is really almost impossible to see. But they put their hands in this dust, and they put their hands in the mouth. Hand-mouth behavior. Lead is mistaken by the body for calcium. So while a child can crawl across a floor of lead dust on it, get very little one day, over a period of time, because the lead is mistaken for calcium and the body holds on to calcium, it accumulates over time. And finally, what is initially a trivial exposure becomes a deadly exposure. Right? There's also other kinds of sources of exposure, not as common. There's lead in the soil from lead gasoline. It's also lead in products. Some of the products in health food stores. Some of the products that are available not in health food stores. So you have to be careful of things that come from China, things that come from India. There's a lot of contamination sometimes in dishes and food items. It's ubiquitous. It's all over the place. But primarily, the way is from lead dust, from flaking paint, which is extremely common. I can't remember the estimate of number of houses estimated still have leaded paint in them. But when they outlawed leaded paint, they didn't make any provision for removing the lead that was already there. So the lead in older houses built before 1975, and generally, as you go back further in time, more common, there generally is lead. And even if it's not coming from a window surface or a door or friction zone, if it's underneath the paint and you say you do want to do rehab in your house and you dry sanding of the walls, it comes out again. Or if you do do construction, comes out as a dust. So there are innumerable ways to get poisoned.
Okay, so this is interesting because we've planted the seeds about why this matters because we've generally talked about brain development. I want to put a pin in that because I always want to draw a straight line to why this is relevant to the conduct that a person, the crime they have committed or the decisions they have made. But we're going to wait on that. But I just want to put that out there. We're going to keep you in suspense as to sort of the effect of lead and how we see that playing out in practical ways in our cases. But when you're talking about that, I'm sort of in my own lawyer brain figuring out, okay, proof is everything. The evidence is everything. So you have a client, and let's just say for now, you suspect there's been lead poisoning. I don't know how you would, maybe putting the cart before the horse there too, but unless they still have that family home that they've lived in pre-78, I think you said, that you can actually go down there with an environmental crew and do lead testing, or, unless there's been a lawsuit because they've been poisoned by the local mine. How do you even how do you quantify or prove that they've been exposed to lead so many years after the fact?
In many states, I do a lot of work in New York, for example. In many states, it's mandated that children be tested for lead at 1 year and 2 years of age. If there is a lead level that exceeds, but actually it depends on the state, what the cutoff is. Sometimes any lead level is reported, and many times if it exceeds the level, it's considered to be poisonous. That's get back to that in a second, why that's not foolproof. But by going through a ton of health records, you can sometimes find out. If you find out where the person lived before, if it is an older neighborhood, older housing, then there's a strong possibility.
Mm-hmm.
Lead is deposited, as I said, all over the body, and it takes the place of calcium. If you have some of the baby teeth, often if a child's been poisoned, and the lead will show up in the teeth, so that there aren't that many labs that do this kind of analysis anymore, but there are some.
Wow.
Primarily university laboratories. But if you have some of the baby teeth, you can look at that. If there's lead in the baby teeth, the child's been poisoned.
Can I jump in? Because
Sure.
one of the things about exposure, we talked a lot about historically, it used to be in gas and it used to be in paint and everything else, but the flint comes to mind. Is there a modern sort of still dilemma about, the bad pipe? I seem to recall there was a lead issue and with the bad water pipes and everything in Flint. Is that something to pay attention to in various communities?
I think in every community. I'm living in Cleveland right now, and this house was built in 1950, and we checked there was lead paint, which we were able to get rid of. We checked the water, and we were told that the level of water, there was lead in the water, because I said it's ubiquitous, but don't worry, it's at a low level. The thing is, you're drinking water every day. It's in my coffee. Low level is not acceptable. Lead accumulates over time. Lead is still poisonous to adults, and especially as we get older, it becomes more poisonous again, more dangerous. It's dangerous at both ends of the spectrum, very young, very old. So there are instances of contamination of water in most every older city where they look for it, if they look for it. So it's something to be concerned about. In a house, it's important if you move into even a newer house, it's an older water line, something to be considered. So the water should be checked.
Wow.
And not all water filters will filter out lead. You have to be careful. You have to look at the specs.
Wow.
So we couldn't change the pipes, but we have a particular water filtering system that gets rid of lead. That's the only way to approach it.
Okay. So, and I don't know if this is more cart before the horse, but now let's say, okay, practically speaking, defense lawyers are not going to, just as a matter of course, do lead testing. Well, actually, before we get to that, can I test just the person and they're in their body and have any quantifiable results?
There's something called half-life, which means how long it takes for a substance that's in the body to decrease to half its level. It gives you some idea how long it hangs around. The half-life of lead in the brain with a single exposure, not a long-term exposure. Long-term exposure prolongs half-life. With a single exposure, the half-life in the blood is about 30 days. Half-life in the brain is about 2 years. But the half-life in the long bones, like the leg and the arm, is 20 to 30 years. So if a person has had a significant exposure to lead, it's probably in the bones. Now, there are ways to check this. The techniques, there's a doctor named Dr. William Biffany, who has done some work in this. And there are ways to assess that even with exposure 20, 30 years after the fact, whether there's been a significant exposure to lead.
What about in the brain, like brain scans and things like that?
There's nothing yet that I know of that can show that.
Okay. All right. So then that brings me back to my question that I was about to ask, which is, we don't have the time, the resources, or the inclination to just, as a matter of course, for no reason, check every client to see if they have lead in their bones, or go to their childhood home and test the paint and the water and everything else. So what would even raise an eyebrow? What would cause us to even have a hint that that might be worth investigating in a case involving a person who is charged with a crime?
Environmentally, if they come from an older house, especially in a poor neighborhood, they said lead paint used to be used everywhere. It was the best paint, right? So in the older houses, especially, you just take a look at the house. If it has original windows, it's probably a tip off that that kids been exposed to lead. If it's probably, even if it's been painted, it's probably under the paint. Typically, they have, in the poor neighborhoods, haven't been painted. This flaking paint. Yeah, if in an older neighborhood, it's a good shot that that's been some exposure to lead. Behaviorally, if you have that information, say a child came from a house built in the 50s, it's an older house falling apart. Behaviorally, there is no what's called a behavioral signature of lead. Like you can see certain symptoms in a kid, and without knowing anything else about him, no, this is lead. But there's certain things you see quite often, and one of them is problems with impulse control and problems with attention. If you see that, to the extent that it's really significant and they come from an older house, it's worth looking into.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's going to draw our straight line right there, because it's anything from driving under the influence to murder could be an issue involving impulse control, executive functioning, cognitive impairment, and everything else. So would it probably make sense also to dig around in school records and see developmentally how a child is functioning in their early years in the educational system?
Yeah, we'll get to that later on, but
okay,
one of the major effects of lead is that kids don't do well in school. If they don't do well academically, even if their behavior is okay, typically the behavior is not okay. They'll talk about problems with self-control, problems with paying attention, aggression, problems with impulse control. That's very typical in a child's been poisoned. Again, it's not, it's not specific. A lot of causes for those kinds of problems. But if you have all these things together, you have an older house in a poor neighborhood, kid with impulse control problems in school, it's a reasonable possibility.
Yeah. Okay. And I always think about, the government loves to do this bad seed argument, especially in capital cases, which is looking at the history. They've been in trouble since the day they were born. That's a Dukes of Hazzard song, isn't it? Been in trouble with the law since the day they were born. But they look at it and say, well, they're just bad people. They're just inherently criminal and everything else. And the answer is maybe there's a different story here. Maybe the story is they're poisoned as a child, and that has impacted their ability to function with impulse control and attention and everything else. It sort of builds and builds and builds, because if a child has impulse control or attention deficit issues, those are going to cause a whole other host of issues in their life in terms of depression, anxiety, substance abuse. Are we jumping ahead on that too?
A little bit too, but
okay. Where do we go next with this?
If a kid has, we'll talk about it at length a little later on, but if a kid is having problems in school and he gets labeled, and then on the other hand, he has poor impulse control, these two things together, it spirals. Mm-hmm. If kid gets poisoned at usually typical age, the most common age is like 2 and 3, a lot of hand-mouth behavior. Time to 5 years old, they even if they're not showing problems in development, they'll be showing problems with behavior, with problems with hyperactivity and other problems. So to say the child's been is a bad egg, he's been bad from birth, kids get poisoned very early, and the effects start taking hold very early. So yeah, they may be showing bad behavior, but it could be an effect of a brain injury from lead.
Yeah, it's through no fault of their own. And you think about, and probably jumping on this too, but socioeconomic status. So not only does that sound like it might increase your risk of exposure, but it's going to increase the chances that you're not going to get the intervention, the help, the therapy, the attention, because all of those things, I mean, I don't know that they can be cured, but the effects can be ameliorated if you've got attention. I mean, I think there are people in more affluent situations that have a lot of the same kinds of issues, but they're getting therapy, they're getting medication, they might get a special school, they might get all kinds of help. But
they might get taken away from the source of poisoning, moved out of their house.
Yeah.
And there's something else, which we're getting ahead of ourselves again. There's something in toxicology called effect modification. And that is that certain things in the person's environmental context will amplify the effects of a poison. And it's been shown for lead, and it's not clear what the actual stimuli are, that in a lower socioeconomic environment, the effects of lead are more profound than a child is at a higher level socioeconomically.
Yeah. And it should be obvious to people that are listening, but the majority of the cases that a criminal defense lawyer is going to encounter mostly are cases where it's a lower socioeconomic environment. So that's almost a given in cases. So, okay. So what's next? Where do we go next?
Want to find out what lead does to the brain?
Yeah, let's talk about what lead does to the brain.
It's just to give you some background about how lead works and how you detect it. Lead's a neurotoxin. You measure by a blood test, right? And the blood test is micrograms, which is millionths of a gram of lead in 100 milliliters, 100 cc's of blood. The threshold, this graph shows the various things, what happens at various levels. At levels above 100, you could have encephalopathy and death, essentially. As you work your way down, you see it's anemia, problems with the kidneys, problems with synthesis of blood, so all the way down. Finally, we get to the very bottom when you're getting levels of below 2 or 3 micrograms per deciliter. It's brain damage. It's a very, very potent neurotoxin. Primary source is deteriorating paint. You can see this as a great example of this. And these friction surfaces, even if this paint was covered up, the friction of the window going up and down very liberates it in a fine dust. And kids either will ingest it or they'll inhale the fine dust itself, also soil and water, and then it's contaminated products. Once it gets into the body, it's circulated through the blood, and it's deposited all over the body. Wherever calcium goes, lead goes. Brain, bone, kidneys, lungs, bone marrow, everything. Reason why it's more dangerous for children is children absorb more of it, retain more of it, more is deposited in their brain, and it's much more toxic to developing brain cells.
And just so people who aren't looking at the slides, that slide, and you've said it once before at the beginning, but that slide is labeled and it's just so powerful. A child's poison.
Right.
And just you think about that in the grand narrative of our mitigation story, we are talking about things that happen to a child who had no say, no control over, any of it, that has now changed the trajectory of their life. And in terms of mitigation stories, these are the most powerful, especially in capital cases. I always look for a theme that runs through, a thread that runs through. And the idea of poison, I think you're going to find that theme running through all through many of your mitigation stories, which is to say lead is the poison, but there's other poison or toxins that are going to exist in your client's life that are going to exacerbate that or amplify, as you said, the effects of the lead. And then ultimately, if you're talking about capital cases, which we do a lot of, that's the end result that you're trying to avoid. And the irony should not be lost that this is a person who was poisoned as a child, and now the state wants to end their life, usually by injecting them with poison. And it's terrifying when you think of it through that lens of narrative, but it's true. And that's a very powerful mitigation story. So I know I'm putting a fine point on the obvious to you, but I want to make sure people are listening to this understand how powerful this really is. All right, go ahead.
All right, this next graph shows half-life. I'll put it for people who can't see it. Half-life, as I said before, describes how long any toxin or any chemicals in the body. So half-life in blood with a single exposure is about 30 days, life of a blood cell. In the brain, it's about 2.5 years. In the long bones, it's 20 to 30 years. So if you think about this, a child who has significant exposure when they're 1 year old, 2 years old, will still have some residue of lead in their bones when they're over the age of 60. And the reason why the levels in the bone are going down is basically leaching out into the blood and circulating and getting around and going back into the brain. This is one reason why lead is also a generational poison. If a little girl is poisoned and later on when she has childbearing years, she becomes pregnant, the lead that's stored in her bones, because there's a need for calcium, becomes liberated, and then it goes through the placenta and poisons the fetus. So it's not just a one-time thing in one child. In one child, there's also work that's now developing research on genetic effects of lead and epigenetics, and this is a way that the effects of lead can be passed generationally through genetics. A lot of the work's being done by somebody at the Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia by Dr. Jay Schneider. It's very interesting work, but it just
I don't want to put you on the spot with the research there, but what's the general takeaway, genetically speaking? What's the harm?
There are effects on genes that are involved in attention and other aspects of behavior that can be passed on to the next generation through epigenetics.
Interesting. Okay.
This next slide, this shows the effects of lead on the brain. Lead causes brain damage, right? This is a average grouped MRI from a group in Pennsylvania, where they show the volumetric effects of lead. And you can see that in this slide, there are spots that are reddish to yellow. That shows that areas of the brain where tissue has been lost or where it's been thinning. And this graph shows that the effects are throughout the brain. But there's one area that's particularly hit hard, is the frontal lobes, which has significance behaviorally, which I'll get to later.
Mm-hmm.
And these effects are seen at very low levels. And the question is why, when you see a young adult who's been poisoned as a child, they seem entirely normal, which seems to be counterintuitive. The child's been brain damaged. This next slide shows why this is the case. The sensory systems, which are shown in the upper part of the graph, the motor systems that control movement, the middle part, and the so-called integrative systems that control memory, attention, executive functioning in the lower part. It shows how these different parts of the brain develop different times. The sensory systems and motor systems, the systems involved in sensing, feeling, seeing, hearing, develop fairly early. The motor systems also fairly early. Kids get lead poisoned when those two systems are starting to reach the end of their development. So a kid doesn't have profound sensory problems or profound motor problems as a result of lead. But that part of that time in development is when the integrative systems, the thinking systems, are just starting to really develop. And that's what gets hit hard. So the kind of damage you get is not a damage of a sensory system or a motor system where a kid might be blind or in a wheelchair. It's a problem of a thinking system where the problem is an injury to the ability to remember, to control impulses, to have social judgment, to reason. All of these things are affected, and they don't show up physically when you look at somebody. They only show up in their behavior, and they can show up on formal testing, which is actually one thing, getting back to something you raised at the beginning of this podcast. How do you know the kid's been lead poisoned? There's one other thing you could do is to test for brain injury, not for to the extent of a scan or an X-ray, but the type of testing that's been designed specifically to identify the behavioral effects of brain injury. It's called neuropsychological testing. It's not the same thing as psychological. It's different, right? It is the gold standard for whether any individual has suffered a behaviorally significant brain injury, right? Even with a scan that shows, say, a lesion in the brain, you don't know what the person can or cannot do until you actually test them, right? And there's instances where there's compensation, the person can be brain damaged and it doesn't show up at all. Brain damage shows up on a scan, behaviorally there's nothing. So what you really needs to be done is a neuropsychological evaluation. If you have an older house, a kid who shows all these behavioral signs in school, and then you do a neuropsych and you find brain injury, all these things fit together.
Yeah. And I know you didn't say that in an attempt to plug you, but I'm going to plug you because that's what you are and that's what you do. You're a neuropsychologist. That is in your wheelhouse. And the point is, this is invisible in so many ways, but a neuropsych exam can bring it to the forefront, can make it tangible. It's the evidence that we're looking for. It can be. Yeah. Okay.
This was just one thing to reiterate is the major damage. It's in a lot of places, but a lot of it is in the frontal lobes, and frontal lobes mediate what's called executive functioning, which means primarily reasoning ability, social judgment, impulse control, which has obvious.
Yeah. So let's just highlight that: reasoning ability, social judgment, and impulse control. That's the whole ball of wax when it comes to 99% of the cases that we handle. The question is, why on earth did they make this choice? Because everyone says you chose to do this and it was your choice and your consequence, and I guess that's true. But the question always is why. And if you have no good, rational, true, credible explanation for why, you're leaving the story in the hands of the prosecutor and unfortunately the hands of the judge, which is you're a bad person, you don't care, you're thoughtless, you're heartless, you're greedy. All of these stories that the government wants to tell. And there's a better story. There can be a better story that explains super bad, horrible decision making or judgment or impulse control. So that's we're always trying to tie. It's like the Big Lebowski, the rug that ties the room together. We always need to be mindful that there is a line to be drawn, and that is, to me, that's it. That's the bullseye right there.
There's something called the frontal lobe syndrome, which is from damage to the frontal lobes from any cause. Lead being one of the other things as well, which is primarily lack of motivation, inability to plan ahead, poor judgment, difficulty moving from one task to another, one idea to another, difficulty staying on task, being pulled back and forth by internal distractions and external distractions, irritability, problems with impulse control, aggression, and low frustration tolerance. This is really a frontal lobe syndrome.
And I'm sorry I keep interrupting, but I'm a story guy and I have all these stories playing in my head. And, you say, okay, well, my client's accused of selling drugs. And it's like, really? You're going to say he sells drugs because he has lead poisoning? But if you look at that list, these are all the things that, I'm a lawyer because I was able to pay attention in school. I was able to get good grades. I was able to sit still for a test. I was able to do X, Y, and Z. But when you have all those impairments that are the direct result of poisoning, your options are limited. And so, maybe you're going to do something like that to make a living because the doors are closed for you. Now, I know that's not always a palatable explanation for behavior, but I think it's all part of the story. It's again like their story is you're lazy, frontal lobe. So lack of motivation, inability to plan ahead. That's a big one. Yeah. If I do this, I can think about X, Y, and Z that happens down the road. Nope, that's out the window. Poor judgment. We talked about difficulty for moving from one task of an idea to another. Pulled by internal or external distractions. So could that be like easily led by bad influences?
Sure.
Yeah. So you're talking about followers, not leaders, oftentimes, right?
right?
Irritability, problem with impulse control we talked about. Oh, aggression. I know we're going to dig deep into aggression and violent crimes and frustration. Okay.
This quote, this is from Mike Martin from the Arizona School Boards Association, just talking about the problems that kids have in school. So I think this is a direct quote. Lead poisoned children have diminished capacity to learn, diminished not for lack of effort or lack of instruction, but because the brain tissues lack the physiological ability to learn.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay. If you ask anybody what lead does to a child, first thing they say, it makes the IQ go down, which is true. And this graph just shows that with the level of 10, you lose about 5 or so points in the full scale IQ. The level of 20 micrograms per deciliter, you lose about 10. With about 30, you lose maybe another 12, altogether 12. This, however, is the tip of the iceberg. An IQ test, again, kind of counterintuitive. Again, an IQ test is not a good measure of brain injury. It's very insensitive. It will respond when there's a brain injury, it goes down somewhat, but it's very insensitive in this particular way. Let me just go back to this graph. The graph shows something that when there's brain injuries, typically, unless it's catastrophic at birth, like from asphyxia or something else, it's not diffuse. It's punctate. It's focal. And the brain functions in such a way that there are systems for doing different things that are located in different parts of the brain. So if you have a person has say a lesion in the back part of the brain where back part of the brain, the occipital lobe that has to do with vision, the person will have problems with vision. They won't have problems with hearing. They won't have problems with reasoning, right? An IQ test. So in order to show that there's a behavioral significant brain injury, you have to do tests that identify specific neurologically mediated behaviors. You have to look at visual memory separately from auditory memory, executive functioning separately from attention, and so on. So an IQ test, which is usually made up of anywhere from 4 to about 15 so-called subtests, measuring a whole host of different things, eventually everything gets factored together and you come up with one score, right? So if a person has a catastrophic loss of visual memory is not even tested on an IQ test. So this kid can have a normal IQ and be totally unable to remember anything that he sees. An IQ test is not a good measure. It will go down, but when you see a decrease of 5 points in IQ, you're talking about something which in real life capabilities could be catastrophic. Right? And I'll just give you an example of what can happen with a brain injury. This is a test of auditory memory, the ability to remember what you've just heard. In this test, the child has read this story. I'm going to read it since people can't see this.
Okay.
Read this paragraph. Donna, a 4th grader, went to Disneyland with her mom, dad, and brother Mark. It was near Christmas time and the park was crowded. Donna loved to see all the people rushing around. Her favorite thing to do was to visit toy shops on Main Street. Poor Mark was too short to see the toys. Top of his head barely reached the countertops. It seemed like all he could see in the busy crowd were knees and legs rushing everywhere. So this story is read to the child, and as soon as you stop, you say, please tell me back everything you've heard. This particular child was a lead poisoned child. His memory of this task was a 4th grader went to Disneyland. End of story. That's it, right? So it could be pretty catastrophic. Here, this is an example of something called visual spatial construction. Child is shown a complicated geometric figure, which in this graph is shown in the center of the slide. Then the child is asked to draw it with the right, it'll be right, depends if you copy it. And you can see that even with a 6-year-old, they do a pretty good job. By the time you get to a 12-year-old, it's pretty darn accurate. When you show this to a lead poisoned child, this is from a 7-year-old, the model is on the left. The middle is a normal child, which did a good job. The work of the lead poisoned child shows total lack of cohesion, fragmentation, this distortion. This is very typical.
Wow.
Ask a lead poisoned child to copy a diagram from the blackboard. Good luck.
Wow.
This is a test of visual memory. And this test is very similar to the other test. The child is shown the figure on the left, and then it's taken away. And then 30 seconds later, excuse me, 3 minutes later, pardon me, he has to draw it from memory. The memory recall result of a 12-year-old child is shown in the center, and it's very accurate, it's very good. The one of a lead poison child to the right, also 12 years old, you can see the piece is just missing, just has no recollection. To reiterate what I said before, that different things can be affected, different kinds of lesions. A child with a brain injury, especially with lead, may have a visual problem, but not an auditory problem. May have a problem with attention and no problem with memory at all. This is called a lack of behavioral signature. That's why you can't look at a child just based on one thing alone, the behavior, and say lead is the culprit. You have to know more. Right, this next slide shows the effects of lead on school performance as a function of the level of lead exposure. This is a national reading test, and with a level with exposure of 2.5 micrograms per deciliter, which is a very low level lead exposure, you're already seeing effects. And as you go up to even 10, the effects are fairly profound. I'll just read these results because a series of North Carolina studies of over 57,000 children found that children with blood lead levels as low as 4 at 3 years of age were significantly more likely to be classified as learning disabled than children with a level of over 1. So 3 is having a very high effect. There's discernible impact of lead levels on end of grade testing in the 4th grade. This was demonstrated for early childhood blood lead levels at 1 to 2 years of age, levels as low as 2. And the dose response relationship between end of grade testing and blood lead levels of 3 and above were associated with decreases in test scores. So at the low levels, you're seeing decrements to performance that are quite measurable. So the question is there any safe level of exposure of lead? Right, this graph shows what people, basically what science has over time been able to show. Back in the 70s, a level of 40 was considered to be a threshold for poisoning in a child. There's no recognition back then that children are not just simply small adults. They really are different. By 1975, they realized how to drop the level to 30. In 1985, they dropped it to 25. I'm sorry. In 1991, they dropped it to 10. In 2012, they dropped it to 5, and then most recently dropped it to 3.5. This is all based on research that shows the ever lower levels having substantial manageable effects on the child's behavior and abilities. The National Toxicology Program from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, back in 2012, said blood lead levels below 5 cause cognitive deficits. The CDC 2012 concurred and they dropped the level. In January 2012, they dropped it to 3.5. The CDC made the statement, however, that there really is no, at this point, recognizable safe level of lead exposure. So to a very low exposures could be very significant.
Okay.
I mentioned before that there's something called effect modification, which it pertains to any poison. And that is that environmental factors can have an effect upon how severe or how potent the effect of a poison is. It holds true for lead as well. You know, these are factors that may be contributing, but it's not clear which ones are. But diet, low calcium, low iron, high fat, especially high fat, which is junk foods, that increases the absorption of lead. Right? Schools, the lack of early intervention resources, and stress seems to really exacerbate the effects of lead.
And stress would be a very broad category, but would things like trauma, what kind of stress are we talking about? Everybody's stressed. I mean, we all are stressed.
There are things that go beyond that. I mean, lack of I'm trying to think of a way to say this. if they're exposed to say, violence in the home, violence in their school, if they're constantly afraid to go to school, if they get beat up on the way to school, if there are problems at home with drug addiction, with you name it.
Yeah. Okay. So yes. All right. So let's see here. So effect modification is very important. We have talked about it, but again, I'm going to put a fine point on it, because when you look at the story, the narrative from the other side, meaning usually the prosecutor, especially in capital cases, but in lots of cases, their sort of standard retort is, well, lots of people get exposed to lead, but they don't run out and do what your client did, so that's just a lame excuse. So the retort is, well, yeah, lots of people get exposed to it, but there's this thing called effect modification, which amplifies the intensity of the negative effects. And so you can't just look at lead, you have to look at the whole arc of trajectory of their life story to see what other factors are in there in terms of stress and schools and diet and trauma and bad parenting and everything else that are just basically going to be a match to the kerosene that is lead poisoning. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just one more factor. And as far as the fact that not everybody who's been lead poisoned goes out and does whatever crime this is, it's true. But actually, and this we'll get to in a little while also, the probability of a young man who's been lead poisoned running afoul of the law is much greater in a population of kids who've been lead poisoned than those who have not. And I'll get to that in a few minutes.
Okay, yeah.
Factors is how the effects of lead poisoning and brain damage caused by lead poisoning lead to effects in social and emotional development. Lead causes brain damage, this we know, it's settled science. Brain damage causes neuropsychological impairments, memory problems, executive functioning problems, impulse control, so on and so on. Settled science, no question about that. Neuropsychological impairments do two things. They cause problematic behavior and they cause academic difficulty. Those two things, a person who has problems with behavior, a person who has problems at school may be labeled. Those two things are additive, or maybe more than that. If you have low self-esteem and you have poor impulse control, and you're being labeled as being stupid, it can have extreme effects on a person's behavior. If you think of this, so damage of brain areas that control social judgment, damage of brain areas involved in impulse control. Behavioral problems, which could sometimes occur before the academic problems, effects of academic failure on social development, being labeled as being either brain damaged or stupid, and the reactions of adults, lazy, not working up to your potential. All these things add together. And the long-term effects are, you have a kid who either has poor performance in high school or either dropped out or was kicked out. They're either good for manual menial labor or unemployable entirely. They're cognitively impaired. They have a lack of social judgment and poor impulse control. This is a toxic brew. And this is something that's been explored in detail in peer-reviewed literature. This is work by Rick Nevin. There are other studies with other people showing very similar things. This shows the correlation between the lead burden in the environment and violent crime. And as you can see, there's extremely close correlation. This same thing holds true for homicide. This next slide. The same kind of a correlation.
So there's been good research on violent crimes and murder. And so I think if you've got one of those cases with everything on the line, this is something you should be looking at in any case, just to see what's there, because the correlations are so high. But I do want to stress that you don't need a murder case or violent crime and aggravated assault to have lead be a mitigating factor in your narrative. So, but go ahead, lead exposure and murder rate.
Yeah, this is really, I mean, the problem, back in 1991, there was a plan put forth by a study panel at the CDC to end childhood lead poisoning, which would mean remediating all the lead we're one thing to outlaw it, something else to get rid of it. They wanted to do that. And they were told, well, it's too expensive. So the point is, you pay a lot now, or you pay a lot more later. The loss of potential, the loss of people, the cost of crime, it's I would assume it's geometrically more expensive to do what we have done rather than what we should have done.
Mm-hmm.
That's essentially the story.
Okay, so I think we've come to the thrilling conclusion, but I like to end on a hopeful note, which is to say, we've made the case, the evidence is there, we've confirmed it's lead, and we've tied it directly to this violent, or heaven forbid, murder that happened. And the fear that we always run up against, especially in capital cases, is, okay, I get it. Their brain is so damaged that it made them into a murderer. But why doesn't that mean that I shouldn't lock them up for the rest of their life, because they're never going to be safe in the community, and they're violent and they're dangerous and they have no control, no impulse, blah, blah, blah. So the question is there a way to help people who are suffering from these terrible effects of lead poisoning, who might have done bad things? Is there a redemption narrative? Can they be helped to be made better in some way?
Tough question. Once they're an adult and developed, I guess the first thing is to really find out what's going on in as far as their capabilities, which means all kinds of evaluations. The kind of evaluation that's done in a school called psychoeducational. Again, in neuropsych, there's no way to get away from that as well. And because it would depend a lot on the constellation of problems that they actually have.
Every case is different.
Every case is different. Remember, with a child who has a brain injury, and you do an assessment, one of the things you're asking of the data is this child someone who you can find remedial or mitigating strategies to get around their problems, or is this someone whose social judgment, whose empathy, because he's also affected by brain injury, are so damaged that all you're preparing them for is a way to deal with their caretakers. That's one of the questions that has to be asked of an individual. You could have people who will never really, may be productive in a very sheltered environment with control, and other people who may be able to have some rehabilitation. But it really depends on the constellation of deficits. And one of the critical things, especially with the frontal lobes are involved, is empathy, the ability to be able to sense another person's emotions rather than your own. This is something that has to be determined, and that really will determine whether someone needs to be kept in a cage, essentially, or someone who really can be rehabilitated, and if they can, to what extent.
Okay. All right. Well, Dr. Lidsky, I always like to give you the last word. Did you have it, or is there anything else we forgot to talk about that you think might be important to this conversation?
I think we've covered it.
Okay. This was so amazing. And would you, I always like to make sure that people know where they could find you if they need you. Would it be okay if I told folks what your email address? Would that be a good way to? Okay. So it's Dr. Lidsky can be found at Lidsky, Lidsky, @gmail.com. If you think you have a case that he might be useful on, reach out to him, because he knows this stuff backwards and forwards, and now you do too. Or at least you have enough information to spot the issue, and now we know something we didn't know before. So I'm deeply grateful for that, Dr. Lidsky.
Thanks very much. Okay.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff, who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works. I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.